Hello everybody, welcome back to Anglo Election Insights, and today we're batting down the hatches and we're having another little kind of deep dive into the upcoming Victorian state election. We've had a few polls come out recently, plenty of news is starting to appear with MPs retiring and leadership concerns within the coalition, that sort of thing. So good time to talk about it, I felt. So firstly, let's have a look at some polling. So here we've got the 2022 result, Labor, and these are all rounded up to whole numbers, so it's not exactly right, but Labor are leading by 2% on primaries and then 5% on the two-party preferred. And then the last three polls, the last poll from each of these firms that are the main three that have been polling Victoria this year. So with Resolve, they didn't provide a two-party preferred figure. Kevin Bonham estimated it at about like 2.7% lead for the ALP. I'm a little bit sketchy on that one. I see a high independent vote. I actually got in touch with him about this. He calculated it based on the generic flows of preferences from independents and others in the 2022 state election. However, given we've seen One Nation's stratospheric rise, like doubling their vote share in the federal polls since May, I'm starting to wonder if perhaps this high other vote is actually including quite a lot of One Nation voters who were probably going to break for the coalition a little bit more than your typical like generic minor party voter would. So unconfirmed, but I think the two-party preferred could be slightly closer just based on that. He did mention to me that a lot of Labor voters might be parking their vote with a generic independent. The thing is, there's going to be potentially quite a few independents running in Labor heartland seats this coming election, so it may come back to them mostly as preferences, but it might not as well, and it will kind of hurt their primary vote potentially, particularly out west, which we'll get into. But the long and short of it is the LNP leading slightly on primary vote, but the major's not doing so well in Resolve. In Demos AU, a much larger primary vote lead for the coalition, a high Green vote as well, mostly at the expense of Labor here, down on 26. And again, this high vote for others, which I also got in touch with Demos AU. They're using 2022 flows, hence why the LNP are only slightly up on two-party preferred. I think that could actually be, on those numbers, I would think it'd be more like a 52 or 53% lead for the coalition, but that's me speculating and I'm not a pollster. Then finally, Redbridge has basically printed the same poll twice in the last month or so, with, again, the coalition leading 5% on primaries, Labor still on 32, which is a relatively healthy number given where Jacinta Allen is in terms of her approval and that sort of thing. And again, this high other vote. So hopefully soon, if it is indeed One Nation that's pushing that other vote up, perhaps we'll start seeing polls where respondents can actually select One Nation and we can get a more accurate idea of what's happening there. But here, twice in a row, we've had Redbridge put Labor 2% up on two-party preferred. So all these results more or less within the margin of error, but slightly favouring Labor at the moment. What I do find interesting is that the Demos poll, this was taken, I think, early last month, and the one before that came sort of around the peak of the coalition's polling in Victoria, and there was very little change. So just interesting to see that. And I just wanted to reference federal vote intention in Victoria. So these are not particularly large samples. It says they're large samples, but I don't think that's actually the Victorian portion of the sample necessarily. You can see Resolve. Now, the thing to remember with Resolve is that when they do their state poll, they're actually collating their 2 monthly samples from that state at the federal level. So the same federal result that's giving you like 6-7% leads to the ALP is giving you what we just saw here combined. So just keep that in mind, and that's particularly relevant for Queensland state polling at the moment, where Resolve has Labor slightly in front. And then I find this quite interesting. Redbridge is finding Labor only 4% and then 5% ahead in Victoria. So that would be swings to the coalition federally within Victoria. But at the same time, twice in a row, they've found state Labor only running like 2 or 3% behind the federal government, who are, well, I would have thought are way more popular. Certainly Albanese personally is. So just interesting seeing how that might play out. Demos AU, on the other hand, found that the Labor state government was running sort of 5 or 6 points or percent behind the federal brand, which kind of checks out for me. But then at the same time, if we're seeing all these polls federally nationwide where Labor are at the very least, maintaining that 5% two-party lead, then I would expect the Victorian component to be more like 6 or 7% personally. Anyway, so that's a bit of a look at the polling. So now let's get into the more kind of analysis of the Victorian state election. So I just wanted to do a little focus on the Werribee by-election, which you guys will remember was February of this year. So we had Labor just winning by 0.8% on two-party preferred, and the Liberals very narrowly winning on primary vote. You can see both major parties below 30%, quite unprecedented. Well, probably not unprecedented, but in a suburban seat like this, that's not normal. Then Paul Hopper's preference distribution slightly breaking Labor's way, and the Liberals remain very keen to try and do preference deals with Hopper and his candidates, but that given that Paul Hopper's voter base is largely disaffected Labor voters, I would say he has very little to gain from doing that. And you can also see there's a big block of left-wing minor parties here, the Greens, VIC Socialists, Legalised Cannabis, which are taking up a fair chunk of the vote, like what, good 20% of the vote, and then Animal Justice, whatever. So if we see that happen again, you could get some preference leakage, particularly in some of these western suburbs. Speaking of preferences, so as I was saying, pollsters are still using 2022 election preference flows, but we just need to be careful of where preferences might actually end up going in 2026 when it comes to generic other and generic independents. And then I think where you really want to watch the major parties' primary vote is in eastern Melbourne, where you've got more of like the kind of rusted on voters. You've got more of the like Chinese Australian voters as well, and we know that they tend to favour the major parties. So I would expect that from polling of this nature from Resolve, that would probably suit the Liberals quite well in some of the western suburbs. But in the east, I would imagine the coalition do need a bigger lead, where you've probably got a slightly higher Green vote and, obviously a higher vote for the major parties in general. So we have to talk about the Liberals. In most of the polling, in all the polling, Brad Batten is the more popular Premier. Despite the fact that measure tends to favour the incumbents, he debuted like 10% ahead of Jacinta Allen, and he's maintained his lead. So I think, for me, the Liberals have a bit of a winner in terms of Brad Batten. Like he can deliver a pretty clear message. He's well positioned in terms of his background to campaign on crime, which is obviously quite a hot button issue at the moment, particularly in suburban and inner city Melbourne. But of course, the Liberals are the Liberals, and they don't really like winning. So the one sort of good thing they've got, they're deciding that maybe it's not such a good thing. And the thing that they love doing is, of course, knifing leaders and publicly airing their internal disputes. And that's exactly what's going on at the moment. There was a recent cabinet reshuffle where, from the outside looking in, it seemed to me as if high performers from the backbench were being promoted, particularly in the case of Nicole Werner, who's been really active on social media. But of course, I think the treatment of Joe McCracken, the Conservative MP from Western Victoria in the Upper House, and also I think Roma Britnell from Southwest Coast, I think is her seat, both of whom were Batten supporters, I think, and that's really knocked his internal support around a little bit. And if there is a challenge, which there could be, now, if there is a challenge, you're going to want to be sitting down for this one, guys. Apparently, Matt Guy has been maybe not canvassing the party for the numbers, but he does have the support of certain backers in the party. So yeah, we could be three-peating with Matt Guy. Unreal. Okay, so let's get back to the analysis. So we have some retiring MPs who have come out recently. There'll surely be quite a few more as we get nearer the election. But so far, the Liberals have some incumbents in marginals retiring. In Benambra, that looks like a really tight margin, but it is against an independent who's run twice and might not go again. In Croydon, notionally, it would be a Labor seat if you just counted the 2025 federal results. But, it's hard to see if the pollsters are saying now we're looking at kind of a 3 or 4% swing to the coalition. It's hard to imagine Labor can make up ground to win that seat, but still makes it a little bit harder to defend potentially. Same thing in Rowville, and then in Melbourne, this is more of a blue ribbon seat. Probably not a big deal. Labor, on the other hand, they do have quite a few marginals where the MP is retiring. So the first one, Melton, which was always going to be a Liberal target anyway. Apparently the Liberals are quite confident there. Bayswater, I think this one is significant. The sitting MP was well liked, and he actually had a significant personal vote. So that one becomes a key Eastern Liberal target now. Pakenham, really unfortunate what's happened to that MP with the disease that she has, or the medical condition, whatever it is. Really well-liked member. I saw a really nice post from, or at least a nice comment from the federal member for Latrobe, Jason Wood, who, I think really underscored the, the praise that he had for her and the positive feelings that the community had for that particular member. So that makes Pakenham really hard to defend. Same thing in Bass. Again, you've got an ultra-marginal seat and the local members walking away. Not the most helpful thing, but those two seats were going to be under heavy threat anyway. And then over in Sydenham, this seat, it could be a bit of a volatile seat and probably not the best thing for Labor that the member's retiring, but possibly not going to be that decisive. And then you've got these two renegades in Ringwood and South Barwon, where in both cases the sitting MP has been kicked out of the Labor caucus. In South Barwon, the margin's pretty healthy these days for Labor. But in Ringwood, it's 7.5%. And with MLC, now Shadow Minister Nick McGowan, very keen to have a crack at it, I'd say the Liberals must have some sort of confidence that they can win that one back. So that'll be interesting to watch. And just on this map here, you can pause here if you want to see exactly where a few of these seats are. So I want to talk a little bit about the western suburbs, because it's not usually a battleground, but this time it looks like it might be. We saw in that Werribee by-election that rusted-on support for Labor is slipping, which used to be what underpinned this area for Labor, but it's not resulting in these big swings towards the Liberals. People are happy to jump off the Labor bandwagon, but they're definitely not jumping on the Liberal one. So you've got, and Cos Samaras talks a lot about this, the increasingly sort of diverse and professional demographics that point to strength for Labor, who are quite ascendant with like the South Asian community, or always have been at least a little bit, but now perhaps more so. However, it's not as if services, crime, or some of those measures have really improved in the western suburbs, and the perception of neglect definitely remains with, SRL East, the Metro Tunnel, those kinds of projects really sapping a lot from the public purse. And the other thing is that, as often is the case in some of these more diverse communities, is that small business tends to be a large part of the local economy. So there is a bit of an opening there for the Liberals if they can kind of tap into the right narrative there. And then also you've got independent and minor party candidates, particularly in the case of Paul Hopper and his little coalition, who are going to be campaigning hard on a sort of more centrist sort of platform with more localized campaigns, more localized issues-based campaigns as well, and potentially picking candidates who perhaps represent the communities a little bit better. There is certainly it's certainly a place where both the Liberal and the Labor Party tend to kind of have parachuted in candidates who don't really have a great deal of local connection to their communities, and that does make them vulnerable to strong independent challenges. So firstly, we'll talk a little bit about how the Liberals are seeing this area. So they're quite confident of picking up Melton, especially now with the member retiring. Werribee, I've been told that there's a bit of conjecture about whether or not their favoured candidate will or won't run, and that's what ultimately might be decisive in this seat. But then this is also the seat that Paul Hopper lives in and runs his business in, and like his family name has like a suburb named after it. So he's a big name in the region. He obviously did pretty well from a standing start in the by-election. So it's looking at this stage like it could be a bit of a three-horse race. Point Cook, where the demographics are perhaps a little bit friendlier to the Liberals. Apparently they have some strong candidates looking to get pre-selections. That's going to be a target seat despite the margin. And then you've got some of these much more diverse outer suburban seats that the Liberals never used to be like even close to being competitive in. So for example, Sunbury, you've got St Albans, Tarneet even. And Niddry, the margin looks a little bit better for the Liberals, but at the same time, that's Ben Carroll's seat. So there'll probably be a lot of Labor sandbagging. And then in Sydenham, we saw that the local members retiring. I guess Labor can probably start pointing to things like the Westgate Tunnel, which will be open eventually, and also the Metro Tunnel, which is connecting the Sunbury line with the Pakenham-Cranbourne line, I think. So that will probably improve metro services in some of those suburbs. But at the same time, the Liberals can point to, things like crime and the amount of public money that SRL East is taking up, while we still don't have sort of airport connections out west, that kind of thing. So it'd be interesting battlegrounds. Then we've got Paul Hopper and his West Party. I still don't have a great idea of how they're going with candidate selection, if they've really got much of a presence on the ground, and if this movement's going to actually kind of extend beyond Paul Hopper himself running in Werribee, if they actually can find enough momentum to make a bit of a dint in these seats. But one thing I found interesting was that Hopper himself says that a lot of his voters are ex-Labor, and they're coming to him rather than going straight to the Liberals. But when you look at his preferences, they tend to split fairly evenly, maybe with a slightly favouring Labor. As I said, he's not going to do a preference deal, I would say, even though the Liberals really want him to. But if he's running in a bunch of seats and he's taking 10, 15, 20% of Labor's primary vote and then kind of only giving half back to them via preferences, that's going to make for some pretty interesting counts in some of these seats, is all I'll say. But it depends a lot on if they can actually get their campaigns going in time. And then finally, this was a bit of a new one for me. could we be seeing a bit of a teal wave develop on the inner west side? So a community action group who have some very kind of teal-like policy ideas and didn't say no to accepting Climate 200 money when they were asked about it. They've got Williamstown and Footscray in their sights. So they're pointing to some strong results. Some east-west migration of your kind of young professionals, very climate-conscious people who perhaps are feeling a little bit alienated by the politics of the Greens, but also are not impressed with what Labor has dished out in the last kind of 4 to 8 years, and they don't want to vote Liberals. So it could be the case in a seat like Williamstown, for example, where they managed to pull ahead of the Liberals and the Greens, and they ride those preferences home to get above Labor. In Footscray, it's probably a little bit more complicated. This group are actually targeting Footscray most, I think, at this stage. They're going to be in hot competition with the Greens, who backed up their strong result in 2022 with a pretty decent showing in the overlapping federal seat of Fraser. It may come down to where the Liberals send their preferences. Again, when I think Footscray, I think that's a little bit more lower socioeconomic, a little bit more diverse. Doesn't sound very teal-like, but at the same time, it does include suburbs like Yarraville's Seddon, I think, from memory. So they're gentrifying quite quickly. So the different pockets of an electorate like Footscray could throw up some interesting results, and that could turn out to be quite a complicated count in the end. And then we have the Eastern Marginals, of course. These are your classic kind of politically volatile seats that generally decide the outcome of elections, the exception being in 1999 where Labor swept the regions to come to power. But essentially, if Labor can hang on to most of their 2018 and 2022 gains in Melbourne's East, mostly off the back of their strengthening vote with your younger professionals and Chinese Australians, then the coalition are basically going to be locked out of government. And I'm finding it hard to see a way for the coalition to make up the 16 seats or whatever they need to form government if they're not winning probably at least 4 of these seats. So you've got Glen Waverley, Bayswater, Ashwood, Box Hill and Ringwood. I think at the moment they're a good chance in at least 2 of those, half a chance in 3, but Ashwood and Box Hill, they're definitely trending hard against the Liberal Party. And with some of these seats being right in the way of the suburban rail loop, and obviously you've got the relationship between Victorian Labor and the Chinese government and how that impacts the Chinese Australian diaspora. It's an uphill battle, is all I'll say. So this is kind of my little map, just as I see things at the moment. 10 toss-up seats where I think things are going to be very contested, but that also includes some inner north Labor versus Green battles as well. So out of the gate, I'm giving 38 seats to Labor and 36 seats to the coalition. But then at least 3 of those, I think, are definitely going to go either Labor or Green. So it's kind of more like... So, I mean, right there, you've pretty much got a minority Labor government, even if the coalition managed to sweep the rest of these seats. So somehow the coalition are going to have to improve their position in the polls a little bit more and make some other seats, particularly Melbourne's West, a little bit more competitive in order to eke out government for themselves, or they're going to have to rely on Hopper's party and these teals and these other challenges to Labor's dominance in the West to potentially be able to cobble together some sort of minority government themselves. So that's it from me today. Thanks for watching, guys. I will have my Anglosphere polling update hopefully out on Sunday or Monday. In the meantime, have a really great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.